Welcome to All Right in Sin City, a podcast about writers and writing in the Windsor-Detroit region. Your podcasters today are
Sarah Jarvis, former bookseller, publishing rep, and literary festival chair.
Kim Conklin, Windsor-based writer and filmmaker.
and me, Irene Moore Davis, author, educator, and local historian.
Our featured guest today is Jade Wallace. Jade Wallace's fiction, poetry, and essays have been published or are forthcoming in Canada, the US, the UK, Ireland, Sweden, New Zealand, and India. They are the author of several chapbooks, most recently the collaborative ZED with 2 Zs with Collusion Books, and Test Culture with ZED Press, and the solo Rituals of Parsing with Anstruther Press. Jade's most recent chapbook is Southern Ontario Gothic Tour in 2020. Their writing has won the Muriel's Journey Poetry Prize and the Anita and Alistair MacLeod Prize, and has been nominated for the Journey Prize. A former legal worker, they're currently the reviews editor for CAROUSEL, an organizing member of Draft Reading Series, an MA student in creative writing at the University of Windsor, and one half of the collaborative writing partnership MADE. I hope I pronounced that right. Welcome, Jade.
Thank you for having me.
You juggle many portfolios on top of your master's studies. Of your roles as poet, editor, and student, which is your primary focus creatively?
That's an interesting question. I mean, there's a lot of overlap between the writing right now and the thesis work, because my thesis is actually a novel. So, I mean, there is writing I'm doing that's not for my thesis that I'm trying to accomplish simultaneously, but there's a lot of overlap in the various areas. And then I try to shuffle a lot of my, how shall we say, osmosis of literature, like reading and things, into my reviews role. But they all inform each other. I mean, it's hard not to read something and then want to write about it, I suppose.
So how do you juggle all these roles in terms of time? What's your process?
That's a great question. I'm not sure. Mostly I feel like I'm behind on everything constantly, but in reality, I have a pretty rigid weekly schedule that I've set, even though we're in this time of lockdown and I'm home every day, all day. I have certain mornings where I will work on certain things, particularly if there are things I have to do for other people, and just setting aside a couple of hours per day to knock out a couple pages of the thesis. And I don't really do much else these days except work and sleep, so it's not too bad, I guess.
Well, I think that, it speaks for a lot of people. That's all we do is work and sleep right now. So, Well, you mentioned that your thesis is going to be a novel, but mostly you've been working on poetry. What brought you to poetry, and has it been your main genre and the fiction is new, or have you always done both?
Yeah, the poetry started, I suppose, when I was 8, and probably like most kids, it was a school assignment I had to do, but I immediately loved it and ever since wrote poetry to, greater or lesser capacities, I suppose. And so it's just been this lifelong thing for me, whereas fiction, at some point I realized I was terrified of writing it, probably in my early 20s. I had never really attempted to write it much. And I thought, well, that's not really great. I mean, you shouldn't just not write something because you're afraid of the genre or the form. So I decided to try and start writing, and I used this method that I weirdly got from reading Nietzsche, of all people, where I would just try to write a one-page story. And, if it wasn't exactly one page, that was fine, but I tried to at least write a one-page story and then really gradually build to longer and longer stories, which has been an excruciatingly long process, I have to say, to work up to like a full-length story. But yeah, now I write short fiction, and as I'm getting into my thesis, I've also been attempting this novel. So we'll see how that goes. I'm not really sure. I feel more comfortable indeed writing poetry, but it's sort of interesting to bring to bear the skill sets of poetry on fiction. And I find a lot of writers seem to be able to make that transition fairly smoothly, and I hope to one day be among them.
What do you find most useful from your poetry skill set that you've been transferring to fiction?
I think the main thing is this perhaps an over-attentiveness to language, really, where in a poem, you're so sensitive to the fact that each word must be not perfect, I'll say, but must have its place and must have its use. And you don't have extraneous words generally in poetry, or words that don't quite fit. And I do find one of my qualms with fiction I don't like tends to be that it seems a little bit imprecise in its language, or it's a little bit, just too casual with language. It's too easy to slip, I think, into cliche when you're writing fiction in a way that's harder in poetry. And so I guess that sensitivity or attentiveness to the perfection of each individual word is both helpful for writing fiction and extremely trying, because it's very hard to get anywhere on a 50,000 word novel when you're belaboring every word. But at the same time, overall, I find I prefer that process, I think.
You seem to have a collaborative approach to your output in terms of cooperative chapbook and a writing collaborative made with Marc La Liberté. How does that approach work? Do you each write a separate work and edit each other, or like songwriters combine resources and lines and forms together?
Yeah, I've done collaborative writing in various contexts before, but the only really sustained effort is this group of two of us, myself and Marc La Liberté, called MADE. And we've used actually a few approaches. I mean, we kind of try to do different things depending on the project we're working on. The way we started out was we would actually sort of get a document. We were working in the same space, and one of us would write a line or two, and then the other would have to write the next line or two, and just build a poem. And then we would stop basically when neither of us had anything more to say in that vein. And then we would go back together and sort of edit by consensus. If there were things we both thought weren't working, we would change them. And that's, I would say, probably been our predominant mode. I mean, we've diversified a little bit since then, I suppose. So we also did Test Center, which is the chapbook with ZED Press, which had some people based in Windsor involved in it. So there's a local connection there. And for that one, we were writing a series of poems about different types of tests, whether they're physical tests or psychological tests or legal tests. We just had all these tests. I think there were about 17 of them in the book. And we wrote little poems about them. And we kind of took turns on those. Like, we would each assign ourselves basically certain tests we were interested in. And so the project was collaborative, but the individual poems were mostly self-composed. And yeah, we try to be very open just to different ways of working together to bring our skill sets to bear. So like right now we're working on this ekphrastic project. Mark's also a visual artist, so he's been making these photographs of sculptures he's done, and then we try to write to them. So that's an interesting way of bringing, because I obviously have no visual art skills, so I don't bring any skills in that area. But I sort of bring more of the poetry and he brings slightly more of the visual art, but then we try to collaborate in terms of the concept. So like he'll ask for my input on, say, the color scheme in the photo, and he'll obviously have input into the poems and that kind of thing.
So how does that differ perhaps when you're working on your own projects? What's different about your approach when you're writing solo?
I suppose when you're writing solo, it's in some ways relaxing because you don't have to please anyone in particular, I mean, except yourself. Whereas when you're writing with someone, not only are you thinking about, writing that you obviously like, I don't want to dislike anything I create, but also what the other person will like, what's going to work well for both of your voices. Like, I think of it, you mentioned being in a band, and it is kind of like that. You're thinking about like how to harmonize with each other in a way so that it doesn't feel like you're just mashing things that don't fit together, but you're producing something that's conscious of the other person and conscious of how your voices together work as a unit. And so there's this whole other layer of considerations you have to take into account when you're doing collaborative writing that when you're writing by yourself, you really don't. It's like, well, what do I feel like writing today? I don't know. I guess I'll, do whatever I want. So I'd say that's the major difference, really, those like levels of accountability.
What does capture your attention when you're working on your own? What tends to draw you?
There's, I guess, several facets to that question, right? There's like the content matter that draws me, which I have to say, I listen to a lot of quote unquote true crime, and I have some issues with that as a genre, but that sort of that whole preoccupation with I suppose violence and with the margins of human behavior is something that really interests me. So, like talking about death, talking about violence and harm and all these things, that's certainly one aspect of it. And then I have a completely other impulse, which is just like, I like pretty things. Like I like words that sound nice, and I like animals that look weird, and I like, all these little like kind of trinkety things that you collect magpie like, and I want to bring all those things together in poems. And then I've got, I would say probably the third sphere is more of this, like, I guess your literary interests, like your literary, like philosophical interests. I do enjoy philosophy. I hate to say it, but, and so there's this weird, almost like scholarly line in my work too. I hesitate to use the word scholarly, but I don't really know what else to call it. But it's this, this overly, I suppose, intellectualized way of approaching poems sometimes. And those things all sound very discordant, and they kind of are. And so trying to like marry them into something that's a coherent poem, I guess, is what preoccupies me a lot. And then in terms of form, I mean, that's a whole other set of considerations, I guess, and really depends on the individual poem. I think form should really like be born organically out of content somehow. But
so from all of this, you really have embraced the world of editing as well, formal editing, as well as what you work on as collaborative and with your own poems. So how did you get involved? What drew you into the world of editing?
Well, I actually think editing is collaborative. I mean, I think it's like a different type of creative collaboration in many ways. And for me, the most successful editing relationships, regardless of what you're editing, really, whether it's poetry or essays or whatever else, is really about learning to understand the other person. So whether you're on the writer end and you're trying to think about your reader, whether it's a specific one or a general audience, thinking about like what is actually going to communicate successfully with them, and what are you conveying? And maybe it's not always what you expect to convey, and like how do you reckon with that? But on the editor's end, I think it's really, to me, about understanding a couple of things. So, I mean, first you're trying to understand what the writer is getting at and how best to convey that, which then also requires you to imagine how other people might read this piece of writing. Even if it's, so if I look at a sentence as the editor, I might read it one way, but also be aware that someone else could read it a second or a third way. And I have to think about that when I'm suggesting edits to the writer. And so there really is, to me, this like cooperative and like really, and it's kind of an overused word these days, but empathetic process that has to happen to me when you're editing. And depending on the context. So for example, I edit reviews for CAROUSEL. And so I'm working with a lot of reviewers who I might not know extremely well, might be professional acquaintances, but not much more than that. And so trying to understand what their priorities are, but then also balancing those with obviously the priorities of the journal, which has its own aesthetic and considerations. And then also trying to think about, well, what does this all mean in the world of literature? Like, what's the place of CAROUSEL? What's the place of this review? What's the place of this book we're reviewing? And trying to just balance all those considerations at the same time to have a review that seems to contribute something to the world. And how can I, polish it up as editor so that it contributes as best it can the ideas that the writer has, I guess.
How did you get involved with CAROUSEL as reviews editor?
So my partner, Mark LaLiberty, has been leading CAROUSEL for God, I don't even know how long, many years. He's the managing editor. He does their design work. And we were talking, they didn't used to really publish reviews. They've published almost no reviews in their history, even though they've been around for 30 years. And we were talking at one point and I said, I like the idea of reviewing books. I think it's wonderful that we have this like public conversation about books. I think that's so important. God, I find reviews so boring most of the time. Like I don't want to read them. I mean, I appreciate when someone writes them, but I don't actually want to read them. They're just dull. And I was like, wouldn't it be great if you could have a review space that like really pushes the boundary of what a review is? Because there's so many ways to engage, and it doesn't have to be just this like dry, evaluative essay. And so we've sort of formulated through conversation, we started talking about that. He was like, well, what do you envision a review looking like? And we sort of formulated this idea of experimental reviews, which can take really any form. The whole idea is any media can work. So it can be in the form of visual art, or it can be in the form of poetry or music, which I would love to see. I haven't seen it yet, but all these different media can be used to engage with a text. And he kind of said to me, well, I would love for Carousel to start doing reviews. Do you want to like edit this section? And, you can try to get people to write these experimental reviews and some traditional reviews, and like try to have this real mix of things, just to, again, sort of like push the boundaries of what reviewing is while still trying to really seriously engage with it and its traditions. And so that's what it's grown into. So that's my main role there.
In an essay you wrote on queer poets for Carousel last year, you wrote, and I'm going to read this off my screen here, unlike the classification of queer poetry, which permits a great deal of communal pontification and enduring uncertainty, the decision of whether to describe oneself as a queer poet is an intensely personal choice, and also one that cannot be deferred indefinitely. As a literary society, how do you think that we are doing in terms of promoting and sharing queer poetry in the canon?
That's a good question. I would say, I think there's a lot more publicity around queer poetry within sort of mainstream literary circles than I have seen in the past when I was a younger writer. And it's interesting how that has kind of evolved, because I don't want to speak for all queer writers. Just to be clear, I do identify as a queer writer myself, but I don't want to speak for all of us. And it seems to me that there's still, so when I submit to a literary journal, for example, just to backtrack for a second, I do consider what the venue is. And so if it's a traditional literary journal, I'm submitting to it knowing that, they might have the best of intentions to be queer, tolerant, positive, whatever, however they want to frame it. But I still don't know who I'm submitting to. I don't actually know if they're straight readers, if they're queer, if they're somewhere else on the spectrum of human sexuality. And so I find I tend to be a little bit more, I don't want to say conservative, I hate that word, but restrained, I suppose, in the kinds of things I might send them. And I generally feel less restrained if I'm submitting, for example, to a queer specific journal. And restrained, I guess, in the sense that when you don't know who your audience is, there's a bit of a tendency to want to like explain or really contextualize what you're saying and make it palatable, I guess, in ways that I find queer focused journals tend to be, this isn't universally true, but they tend to be a little bit more, obviously they're more well-versed already in a queer discourse. And so you don't necessarily have to explain as much to them. But also there's a playfulness that, it's kind of even like being among other queer people. Like when you're talking to each other, there's a certain playfulness, there's kind of jokes you can tell because you're all sympathetic. No one in the room is out to get you, so to speak. And when you're in mixed company, you don't necessarily know that. Like there might be someone there who's homophobic and you're just aware of that. And so there's not the same level of lightness, I suppose, in the discourse. And so I think the same holds true for literary circles. Like if you're in mixed company, you don't know who's reading your work, there's a tendency to be a little bit more, like I said, restrained, maybe austere even, in a way that you might not be in queer only circles. So to go back to answering your question, I do think that queerness has really entered literary discourse in a much more visible way, like mainstream literary discourse. Of course, it always existed. There's been queer literature since time immemorial, even accessibly. But yeah, I do still feel there's some kind of distinction. Like it's not just neutral space now. There is still a sense of that identity politics, I guess, playing out.
Do you think we're closer to a time when a poet or any writer does not have to make the distinction? That there's no separate section for queer poetry in stores?
Yeah. I think about that a lot. And I think we can say this for a lot of our identities. Because like there's advantages and disadvantages of having these sort of sectionalized, sections in a bookstore, or overtly identifying your writing as queer versus just letting it be implicit. And I don't actually even know, like when I try to envision like my utopia of the world, which may or may not be other people's, I don't even know ideally what I would want. I mean, my tendency is to often self-identify fairly explicitly for the purpose basically of just as if, trying to communicate to other people, if you are also queer, it's okay. I'm coming from the same place. So when you read my work, you can know we're on some kind of level. And then also for people who aren't queer to say, don't mistake me. You're not reading a straight person's writing. But I mean, in an ideal world, I don't know, maybe in an ideal world, those things wouldn't matter and we would all be equally receptive to each other's experiences and everything could be very fluid. And in some ways, that's how I feel about myself. Like when it comes to gender, for example, you've noticed I use they pronouns. And I tend to think of this gender as this thing. I'm like, God, I wish I didn't even have to identify in any way. I wish I could just be this nebulous kind of like cloud of a human being that had no gender. But we live in a world where people's perceptions are a little bit more taxonomized than that. And so you do end up sort of labeling yourself in order to avoid being mislabeled, I suppose. But yeah, it's a really fascinating question, what we should be working towards. Like, should we be working towards, I mean, obviously I think people should be allowed to identify if they want to or not if they don't. But would it be great to live in a world where we don't have to identify at all? Maybe.
Well, and that kind of leads us into the Brownman Wallace Award. You recently advocated to remove the age cap of 35 for emerging writers because many people in the biopic community don't necessarily start emerging until after 35. And although Charlie Foran of the Trust said that the conversation had been underway for a long time, it is your advocacy that tipped the balance in favor of removing the cap. How do you feel about that? How did that experience? I mean, I don't know. What are your comments, I guess, is the question.
Yeah. Well, we live in a very interesting age for activism because as much as it can at times be as glacially slow as it ever was, at times it can also be extremely quick, depending on where it seems the balance of public opinion falls. And, of course, this is enabled by things like social media and these other ways we have of communicating very, very quickly with each other. And with the Brownman Wallace Award, it was something that had bothered me, not just with this award. There's actually a lot of awards or programs for emerging writers in Canada that have these age caps on them that seem to me completely arbitrary. I mean, what's the difference between a 36-year-old and a 30-year-old, and frankly, even a 20-year-old, in terms of if you're an emerging writer, you're emerging, you are struggling, you don't have those established roots and networks and whatever. And we're all adults. It's not like we're children. And so we face a lot of the same barriers as emerging writers to break into the scene. And those barriers can be amplified depending on our personal life circumstances and our identities. And so it just seemed so arbitrary and unfair that we would cut off people at 35 and say, well, you no longer get support as an emerging writer. You're on your own. Good luck. Especially because depending on our life circumstance, if we come from difficult, marginalized, whatever oppressed life circumstances, it's going to be even harder to emerge as a young person because we don't have the supports in place. And so the age cap just seemed discriminatory to me. And I've thought about this for years. And this year I was like, well, you know what? I'm going to write them an email. And so I did. I wrote them an email and they wrote back very quickly and kind of said, yeah, thank you for bringing this up, but we're aware of it, but also no indication they were going to do anything whatsoever about it, really. So, this being our social media age, I went on Twitter, and I'm not a huge presence on Twitter by any means, but I mostly am friends with writers there. And so I decided to express my views, and I was mostly curious to see whether other people shared them or not. And to my surprise, apparently many people for years have been harboring the same complaints about these emerging writer programs. And specifically the Bronwyn Wallace Award because it's such a prominent and esteemed award. And a friend of mine, Benu Zan, who's a poet from Toronto, she had said, well, why don't you make like an open letter and I'll sign it. And I thought, okay, great. Sure, I'll make an open letter. Maybe a couple of people will sign it. And it kind of just took off and many people signed it. And it was public, but before we'd actually sent it directly to RBC and the Writers Trust, they just said, we'll change our minds. Get rid of the age cap. And I was shocked, frankly, because having been involved in other activist campaigns in the past, it's not generally my experience that you get results quickly, if at all. Or you do get results, but they're like tiny and incremental and they're constantly being rolled back. And so this was, frankly, surprising, but like pleasantly surprising. It was really interesting to me to see how many people were on board with this, because I feel like ageism is one of these axes of discrimination that we don't necessarily talk about as often. Or when we do, it kind of gets collapsed into other like disability related, like ableism, disability related discrimination, which is also like an equally valid, obviously, form of oppression that exists. But this idea that ageism is also in and of itself a problem, generally, not just with literary awards, but more broadly. And I think just even acknowledging that ageism is a problem. If we acknowledge it in one area, we can start to acknowledge it in other areas and think about, well, do our age guidelines or restrictions, whatever they are in any sphere, are they serving a purpose or are they just excluding people needlessly from, programs that would help them? So in some ways, the Bronwyn Wallace Award is like, it's such a small thing. It's one award for poetry. How many people even read and write poetry in Canada, really? I mean, that's not at all to disparage the literary community. I love the literary community, but we're small. Like we're not, it's not like music where everyone on earth, listens to it constantly. And so it's the Bronwyn Wallace Award removal of the age cap for me was like a small victory, and certainly wasn't about me. It was about the many people who felt the same. Like, it was very clearly demonstrated. Me writing to the Writers Trust was not what was effective. What was effective was many people voicing the same opinion. But yeah, keeping in mind that it's a small victory, but it's one that I hope when people look at would think, well, what does this mean? What does this kind of precedent mean for other areas of service and social programming?
Mm-hmm. Well, you also brought up the idea of ageism. I wonder if removing some of that from the awards, which I think it's hugely symbolic, is also going to encourage people to perhaps continue to try, because it kind of removes that assumption you have to be a fully formed writer by a certain point. So it's a wonderful success. How have people responded since then to your success with?
People have been extremely generous. I mean, firstly, people keep congratulating me as if I did it myself, which, I contributed, but, like I said, I'm a small voice and me alone really doesn't accomplish anything, but people have been very generous. They're very willing to acknowledge the labor that goes into these kinds of things and very supportive of the outcome. Honestly, to my surprise, I didn't really have anyone pushing back and saying, well, have you thought about how that's actually a bad policy somehow? There's very little controversy generated by it, which is always surprising with things like this, because, whenever you're pushing back against an inequity of some kind, you often do tend to get pushback on that. And I don't know how to explain the absence of it in this case, but yeah, it's been interesting to see for sure as a process.
Well, segueing from small but mighty communities back to your own work, your chapbook, Southern Ontario Gothic Tour, reflects what many writers connected with this region seem to feel, that there's a certain eeriness to, living near Lake Erie, right? Or Huron. So what does being connected to this region seem to inform in your writing?
I love Ontario. That's a weird thing to say because most people I know from Ontario are like, oh, Ontario is so boring. It's just flat grassland. We want to go to BC. BC is nice. The East Coast is nice. We got to see an ocean. We got to see mountains. I'm like, no, if you guys road tripped around Ontario, it's so beautiful. We've got like the orchards and farmland and city. Like I think it's a wonderful sort of cross section of geographies. But I'm actually originally from Niagara and am a transplant to Windsor. And so I also lived in Toronto for a while, but I've always lived somewhere in Southern Ontario. And probably because I don't have a ton of money, all of my vacations have largely been, vacations I'll put in quote marks, have largely been little road trips around Ontario. It's actually started several years ago. And my partner and I at the time wanted to go on one of these road trips. And we're like, well, where are we going to go? And I said, why don't we pick a bunch of like haunted spots, like spots that are supposed to have ghosts in them. And we'll just go and we'll see those. And, that'll take us on a big roundabout trip through Ontario. And so that's how we called it the Southern Ontario Gothic Tour. And that's how the trip started. And eventually I wrote poems about it and whatever. But I mean, Southern Ontario Gothics, as we know, of course, a genre of writing. We've got, people like Alice Munro and Barbara Gowdy writing what's arguably Southern Ontario Gothic. And I love Southern Gothic as well. Actually, I just love Gothic writing. We'll boil it down to that. I love like the ambiguity of it, that there's this sinister and foreboding atmosphere, but often you can't really pinpoint the source of the terror. Ontario sometimes feels a bit like that to me. I mean, there are certainly obvious horrors in Ontario. I mean, like the homelessness to me, like the rampant homelessness in Ontario to me is just like one of these obvious spectacles of horror that exists here. One that seems so readily fixable, but somehow has not been fixed yet. But even like in the areas where, like, for example, in Windsor, a lot of the homelessness is not visible. It's, kind of hidden in various ways, compared to Toronto, where it's so blatant, like you cannot walk down a street corner without homelessness being evident to you everywhere. But in Windsor, like even where I come from in Niagara, it's a little bit more hidden, or it seems very, very fringe in a way. Like it's a very small, it looks visually like a small problem. But of course, we know it isn't. And so in places like Windsor or Niagara or small towns in Ontario, I do think the Gothic pervades, because a lot of the pain and the harm that's happening, whether it's homelessness or whether it's domestic violence or whether it's any of these issues, it's largely hidden. It's not forefront. We have to like think about it before we really, notice it's there, unless we're living through it personally. And so I think the Gothic really marries well with that. This idea that we all sense that something is amiss, but we're never quite sure what or where it is. Yeah, and I have an unrelated fascination with the paranormal. Not in a way that I necessarily believe it exists, but in a way that I wish it existed. And so I constantly love going to these haunted places and seeing but are there ghosts? Somewhere I would love to see a ghost, but I never have.
So what's your latest or your next writing project to come out? Is it your thesis, or are you working on something else before that?
Oh gosh, I'm working on several things. I have the it feels like a bit of a curse that you can never have fewer than 6 manuscripts at once. So I have one finished poetry manuscript, which Southern Ontario Gothic Tour is the first section of. It's called Love is a Place, But You Cannot Live There. So that's a poetry manuscript that's relatively done. I've been just slowly shopping it out to publishers. I'm working on my second poetry manuscript, and which is not very interesting to talk about, so I'll just skip past that one. I'm working on a short fiction manuscript, which is kind of in an editing stage, and it is called Echo Phenomena. And so echo phenomena is this really interesting psychological term that refers to a whole range of behaviors where people mimic other behaviors. So for example, echolalia is one of the most famous examples, where you tend to repeat someone's words back to them, or you repeat a particular phrase you've heard out of context. So they're all stories sort of framed around this concept of echo phenomena. And I guess I got interested in that because I'm really, in addition to identifying as a queer writer, I also identify as a disabled writer. And I'm really interested in how ableism manifests in psychological discourse, because psychology is this fascinating field where it's like it's supposed to help people ostensibly, it's supposed to help people cope with the world somehow, but at the same time loves to, stigmatize and medicalize, which is sometimes helpful and sometimes not, depending on the person. And so this idea of echo phenomena on its face, I mean, they look like very neutral habits, really, and arguably they are for many people. So whether it's echolalia or whether it's these repeated hand gestures or things like that, like the idea that they're even like somehow pathological or a problem is really something we get from psychological discourse, or not that we get from psychological discourse, but that's reinscribed by psychological discourse. So there's this guise of we have to help, we have to fix, we have to stop these behaviors. Like, are these behaviors even really a problem? Maybe we should look at why we're problematizing them. And so to circle back, the stories, they all deal with echo phenomena, often in ways that are more like figurative or speculative, but they're all sort of focusing on that. So that's a drafted but not quite finished short fiction manuscript. And then the thesis. And then, as I mentioned, with MAID, we have the ekphrastic project going on. We're working on some more poems. We have the chapbook ZZOO that you mentioned earlier, which is all animal related poems. So we're sort of working on turning that into a full manuscript. So I don't know. I don't even know how many manuscripts that is anymore. Several.
Would you like to read some of your work for our listeners?
Sure. I will read a few poems. And since I was just talking about ableism and disability, I'm going to actually read a villanelle. And I want to preface this a little bit because I don't know that it needs a preface, but I'm going to give it one anyways. I love prefacing things. So this poem is really born out of this idea I had, and it comes from reading anti-ableist and disability rights work. And so the sort of the social constructivist model of disability, which says really it's society that identifies certain traits as disabilities. There's no such thing as an inherent like disability. It's just, people function differently. And then how we classify that as a social structure. And I thought about, sort of the various health problems that I navigate around myself. I guess I'm always looking for a way to frame that doesn't just feel bleak and depressing. And I find, obviously, I mean, you can tell from what I just ranted about psychology and medicalization, that doesn't really feel like a useful framework a lot of the time. So I've always been trying to think of for me, dealing with medical conditions really manifests as very scheduled and very organized days. And so, but that's not a very romantic notion, right? Like, you don't really want to think of yourself as this like rigidly scheduled person. That's not fun. That's not exciting. But I was like, well, what's a way to frame that doesn't make it feel so oppressive all the time? And so I started thinking about like when we write a poem, I mean, sure, we write free verse sometimes, but often we write in formal verse or in some kind of we write with constraints. We write with metrical constraints, rhyming constraints, all this. And actually, when we write with those constraints, I mean, this is probably heard the sentiment before, but we write with constraints, that sometimes pushes us into these sort of new ideas and very particular aesthetics that we might not have come to if we just let ourselves write free verse all the time. And so there's a kind of beauty that we get out of these poetic constraints. And I started thinking about, well, maybe there's a correlation there, maybe, or an analogy there, maybe we can think about our lives, even though we might live with various constraints, whether it's schedule or whether it's the kind of foods we can eat or whatever it is, maybe they produce a life that has its own type of beauty, the same way a sonnet has a type of beauty that's different from a villanelle or that's different from free verse or whatever. Anyway, so this first poem is called Villiform. We are confined, the well and the unwell, by the cadence demands our bodies make. Countable as the beats of a villanelle are the hours that pass until need will compel us to pause and cast for water to slake the thirst that constricts us, both well and unwell. While we may delay, we cannot dispel the rhythms of hunger, of sleep and wake, the meter of sonnet or villanelle. And yet some of the forms in which we dwell will forgive us the one or more rules we break. Though we are all bounded, both well and unwell, for some one careless line will wreck the spell, while others less delicate can forsake a few syllables in a villanelle. Envy of the freer feet is hard to quell, but there is another splendor in the ache of constraint that fixes us, more or less well, like velvet syllables in a villanelle. And I don't tend to write very strict form poetry, although that was an example of one that, again, I was talking earlier about how I feel form is really like born out of necessity of content somehow. And so I felt that in that case, there had to be a formal structure because it really paralleled, I guess, the subject matter in a certain way. But I'm actually going to I'm not going to improvise a poem for you. I'm going to read a different poem, and it also has a structure, although you probably will not hear it. You would only see it on the page. This one, it does reference suicide. So if anyone does not want to hear a poem about suicide, now is your chance to stop listening, at least temporarily. Okay. So, and I also mentioned my sort of pet interest in true crime earlier. So this poem is an example of me listening to a particular, again, quote unquote, true crime story and reflecting on it and wanting to write a poem about it. And so if there are any Unsolved Mysteries fans out there, this is from the episode about Jennifer Fairgate, although if you don't know it, it probably does not matter. This is called The Illuminous Cold. Pressing my ear to the locked door that you are, I hear the crystal vial splinter of temporal bone. One clear crack, and your mind whelms the room in a cologne of wormwood and lavender. Notes seep across the threshold to find me kneeling in the hotel hall among some 1,000 thwarted witnesses to your life who pass through this corridor each day, waiting for the sonic boom that recurs with the circling of the earth. After the gunshot, you are a vignette for 14 minutes before the living rush in to bear your unrecognizable body away. They come with their rubber gloves, turn up with their scrub brushes and lie. They tear out the blood-spotted carpet, trash the mattress and duvet. They cannot take you from this room. Its contents have been resignified. The number on the door is now shorthand for your quondam name. You need not respond when echoes from a farther room dismiss you, fellow de se. Their own calumny contradicts this. Outside, we malingerers whisper among ourselves about our silk-stocking pseudo-suicide in her blue-nosed leather heels. For instance, I conjecture that you would never collapse haphazard on a corner of the bed. Regardless, the scant light that transfuses the drawn curtains of your face is an afterimage I cannot close my eyes against. Overcome, I cling to my chosen rumors, my stray inklings, the fiction that you can still be solved. Our own illuminous endings are tantamount to yours. Death will become the moment that we become unknowable. You see, I understand this, so I cannot accept that you are gone to the myriad, another latent enigma. And just to circle things fully back again, I'm going to finally, for my last poem, read a queer poem, a queer love poem of sorts. And this one is called Confantasia. Stranger, I am in love with her, and there are none but a silhouette to tell of tinnitus turn to a chorus of bells, of my blood become soap. Cut me open, I iridesce, organs frosted with a froth of cream. I am bubbling, a drifting sky-bound ring, hollowed to a sparrow's skull, doubling as an offered cup. Stranger, you must hold me up, lest I alight on false and fragrant cypress with its cochlea of years to hear me declare what I would do with world and time. Swear me not a liar, though the stroke of a mislaid finger can so easily make me sing. And that is all.
Jade Wallace, that was wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and your work with us.
Thank you very much again for having me. It was a true delight.
Thanks for joining us. Look for more episodes of All Right in Sin City wherever you listen to podcasts, or check out our website, allrightinsincity.com. For information and announcements of new podcasts, sign up to our email list or follow us on Facebook and Twitter.